It's my great pleasure today to take part in this wonderful interdisciplinary Cambridge Festival, and I'm only sorry that we're not all meeting in person, but perhaps next year. Today's conversation is between two distinguished Cambridge figures, Stephen Toope, Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University, and Phillippe Sands QC, Professor of Law at UCL and Barrister at Matrix Chambers. Together, they will explore the great Cambridge story of human rights and the global reach of Cambridge in the realm of human rights. Law is, of course, not a science. It's a product of human nature, history, and culture. And Stephen Toope and Phillippe Sands have, through their distinguished careers and personal interests in literature, music, and religion, brought all these elements into their work. And I hope the conversation today will explore that interplay. Stephen Toope studied English literature and European history at Harvard University, after which he went on to study law at McGill University and a PhD at Trinity College, Cambridge. He became the 346th Vice Chancellor, and he is concurrently Professor of International Law at the Faculty of Law and a Professorial Fellow at Clare Hall and Honorary Fellow of Trinity, Cambridge. His career has seen him working as a consultant for the Canadian government and a number of United Nations agencies, including in relation to the South African general election in 1994, and as rapporteur of the UN's Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, serving in 2005 as a fact finder for the Commission of Inquiry into actions of Canadian government officials in relation to Ma Ara, a Canadian subjected to rendition in the USA, to Syria. Stephen and Philippe both gave evidence at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in 2004 concerning Iraq. Phillippe Sands read law at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and after completing his postgraduate studies at Cambridge, he spent a year as a visiting scholar at Harvard. He was research fellow at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, and the Lauterpacht Center for International Law, and has held numerous academic positions in London, Paris, New York, Melbourne, Harvard, Toronto, and Lviv, which you will hear more about today. Philippe has a stellar career as a practicing lawyer, acting in dozens of international cases, environmental, investment, border disputes, and human rights, and now acting as an international arbitrator. He's the author of 17 books on international law, but it is his relatively recent move into writing for a wider audience that has brought him wide public acclaim, and shifted indeed how he is seen and perhaps even sees himself as a lawyer. I would say that this started with his book, The Lawless World, and The Torture Team, 2008. Both of these books were concerned with Iraq and the so-called War on Terror. The Torture Team focusing on the role of lawyers in legitimizing torture, perhaps something we can talk about. But it was his book, East-West Streets, on the origins of genocide and the crimes against humanity, which has been translated into 20 languages, that broke through another barrier. He entwined legal history and scholarship with literature. If you've not read it, you must. As cannot be said of many legal texts, it is literally a page turner. I read it in 24 hours cover to cover, and it's been awarded numerous prizes, including the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction. His latest book, The Ratline, Love, Lies and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive, about Otto Wachter, is the extension of that book, and he'll tell you more about it today. I first met Philippe in 1992 when, as a keen 22-year-old obsessed with climate change, I went to work for his Center for International Environmental Law. But we only became firm friends when he allowed me to drive him and a friend in his open-topped Saab to Paris in 1992. Since then, we've been friends and colleagues, and in 2000, together founded Matrix Chambers with 10 other barristers. It seems like yesterday, but how the world has changed. So this is really intended to be Stephen's conversation with Philippe, but perhaps before they get chatting, I can cheekily ask Stephen a question. Stephen, would you be happy to tell us about your relationship with Cambridge, how you came to study here and then to return as Vice Chancellor?
Well, thanks. And it's really wonderful to be with you, Jessica and Philippe, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I came to Cambridge because of international law. There's no two ways about it. I had done my law degrees in common law and civil law, as you mentioned, Jessica, at McGill, and had developed at that time already a very profound interest in international law, mentored by a Croatian professor of international law who was quite a character in and of himself. And then I looked around to figure out where I would want to do a PhD, and Cambridge was frankly my only choice. And we're going to talk about why that is. I know Philippe has strong feelings about this too, but Cambridge is amongst world universities, I think, preeminent in international law and has been for generation after generation. I came here because I wanted to work with a particular person, the Whewell Professor of International Law, Sir Derek Bowett, who was taught by one of the people we're going to talk about later, Hersch Lauterpacht. So the connections are extraordinary, it seems to me, across generations at Cambridge. People who have been profoundly both committed to the development of international law and have indeed, as we'll talk about, shaped it. So it was a great experience. I learned an incredible amount here. I worked with fabulous people, and Sir Derek was the model of the perfect supervisor. I'll come back to that later because I think it's a really important point. Then I went off, and my career was mostly in Canada, although obviously with strong international connections. I became a Vice Chancellor of a Canadian university at one point, and I stepped down from that role and publicly said I would never be a Vice Chancellor again. I'd done that and it was great, and I meant it, and then went back into my own academic work and was loving it, and then got approached by some search consultants saying, Stephen, you're not going to be able to easily just dismiss the opportunity to come to Cambridge. And of course that was true because it had had such a profound effect upon my life. And so here I am, strange times indeed, but also very rewarding times.
Of course, you're the first non-British Chancellor of Cambridge University ever, I believe.
Yes, Vice Chancellor, just to be clear. Yes, I am. I'm apparently. I mean, I always wonder whether in some medieval period there was a German or a French person who actually snuck in. We do know all of the previous Vice Chancellors, but yes, apparently I'm the first. And so that was quite intimidating. And there's no doubt in my mind that I couldn't have come here if I hadn't done a degree here. I don't think they would have gone that far.
Philippe, maybe you can tell us a bit about your story with Cambridge. I mean, obviously, if we're talking foreigners, Elie Lauterpacht was not a Brit, but he was formative for you and crucial for Cambridge in the story of human rights in the world.
Sure. Well, I mean, Cambridge is a very special place for me, if not one of the most special places, because it formed me. I am undoubtedly, in the sense that Stephen has described, a product. Derek Bowett was also one of my teachers. I arrived in '79 as a very sort of green and untested 18-year-old. I didn't actually start doing law. I'd had a fantastic economics teacher at school, actually called Edmund Burke. And I got in to do economics, and we'd covered most of the first year course. And I thought, well, this is no good. So I changed to law, which I must confess I was not completely thrilled about. I have quite strong views about whether law ought to be taught as an undergraduate course. I sort of think the Canadians and Americans and increasingly Australians have got it right. It ought to be a graduate course, basically because I think the university is not to prepare you for professional activity, it's to make you think. But I had one extraordinary teacher, and Stephen, you'll remember him, and that was Robbie Jennings, who was my first teacher of international law in 1980. And here was a class for the first time that I loved. I would look forward to the lectures and the seminars, the tutorials, the little group teaching, which is one of the marks of the wonders of Cambridge. And I decided after my not so great, but not so terrible degree that I got undergraduate to specialize. And somehow I got into the LLM program, and there I met an amazing cast of characters. I was taught by Derek Bowett, Elie Lauterpacht, Chris Greenwood, Philippe Allott. What an extraordinary group of people. I mean, of course, in the present day, one would note they were all male, they were all white, but nevertheless, they were the most fantastic teachers. And I learned a lot. I was formed in a very, I'd say, classical and traditional way. And I then went off and spent a year in America. And there my eyes were opened in a different direction. Having been taught at Cambridge that law has nothing to do with politics, I arrived at Harvard to be told that law is politics. So that has, in a sense, catalyzed the rest of my life. And while I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in April 1984, living in a small, lovely apartment with my then girlfriend above the Grolier Poetry Bookshop, a letter in a pale blue envelope arrived from Elie Lauterpacht. He was going to set up a new research center in Cambridge, the Lauterpacht Center. Would I like to apply for the competitive position of research fellow? I applied, I got the position. I spent 4 incredibly wonderful years there working with Elie, and my life was changed. And I think Cambridge has been hugely significant for me.
It's interesting, your comment about being formed in a traditionalist mode at Cambridge, because I had almost the inverse experience. My background was in international law, emerging from what's often called the Yale School, people out of New Haven who thought of law and sociology and politics as all wrapped up in one thing. And I actually felt, when I graduated from my undergraduate law program, that I actually needed someone who was going to take me through the detail and the rigorous thinking of the more traditional form of international law, and that would help balance me out. And indeed, it really did. I mean, that's one of the things. Derek Bowett was not a great theorist of international law, but he was the consummate practitioner and the consummate pragmatist in thinking through how law functions effectively. And I found that part really stimulating intellectually for me. And I never lost or rejected the more expansive understanding of international law. In fact, it's probably still dominating in my life. But I'm glad I had that really tough, rigorous training here at Cambridge.
No, I mean, I feel exactly the same way. It was a traditional training, but I learned how to read, how to write, how to do footnotes, how to justify my arguments. But it didn't, with one exception, cause me or encourage me to think outside the box. And the person who did do that, and I really do want to pay tribute to him, to my mind, actually from that generation, he was the most important of them, was Philippe, because here was someone who'd actually taken, as I say, yet another path, had been through as a Foreign Office legal advisor in the 60s and 70s, and then somehow emerges at Cambridge. And all of a sudden, he's looking at the world and the law in a totally different way. And I just remember sitting in his room at Trinity, and it was just magical. He would invite the LLM students to spend an evening with, a glass of water or wine or whatever it was, and a bit of fruit and cheese. And we would just talk about these subjects, but in a way that just fractured Derek and Elie and Chris's way of dealing with it. And I think the beauty of the experience in the round was that it was broad church, so that you could end up in a place that was formed by different perspectives.
I'm so glad you mentioned Philippe, because I had exactly the same experience here at Cambridge. I was at Trinity, and I got invited a few times to his room above the great gate of Trinity, extraordinary set. And I remember thinking both that he was almost wild in his intellectual ability to just draw everything together, but also that he was, as you say, fracturing of the traditionalist sensibility, and yet there was no animosity ever. I mean, I talked with Derek about Philippe's views, and he would, I think, sometimes smile bemusedly, but at the same time, he was open to that completely, and he certainly never tried to force a view upon me as a supervisor. It's one of the things that I adored about the experience working with him. So you're right, there was always that mix here as well.
Well, there are a couple of other characters. We'll get on to the Lauterpachts, I'm sure, but then there was dear Chris Greenwood,
who's
aged,
back here now, of course, at
yes,
Cambridge as Master of Modeling.
He was aged about 12 and a half when he lectured us on the war of armed conflict. And of course, with Chris, who I have known now since 1982, I think, so nearly 40 years, our political views are, of course, very different. But I have to say, he's a fantastic lecturer, but even more important than that, and I've never forgotten this, although I fundamentally disagreed with so many elements of the direction he would wish to take international law, and he would encourage us in our exam on law of armed conflict to express our differences, and then gave me a first-class mark. That is a mark of the person, that, you know, we could freely discuss, engage, challenge, and take on, and not be put down for it. And that was, I think, hugely important. I think I learned from that the important thing is to be able to speak openly and to respect differences of perspective and try to learn from them.
I couldn't agree more. And I've had conversations with Christopher on issues related to the use of force, etc. Back to Iraq, you and I both had very similar views on Iraq, and they weren't Christopher's views, but there's never been any sense of discomfort in the relationship or in the conversations. And I agree with you. I think, frankly, that is the mark of a great university. You must be able to have those open debates where there are profound differences. That's something we all know in our era is sometimes a challenge, but I think it's fundamental.
Philippe, can I ask you whether you think that perhaps for both of you, the Iraq War changed your view of your own role as a lawyer, or your position as lawyers within the public sphere, and whether that was a sort of turning point for you that led you into this, down this road that has taken you to be very much more a public figure, and to move towards a literary figure, if I could put it that way.
No question that the Iraq War changed my life. It could have been very different. In January 2003, the BBC got in touch with me and said they were going to do a moot competition on Radio 4 and the World Service, and would I be willing to take the argument for the legality of the war without a further Security Council resolution, just as a sort of theoretical type of thing. And I said, of course, I believe in moots, and I'm happy to try to put the alternative argument to the one I actually believe. I don't believe it's lawful without a further Security Council resolution, but I'm, absolutely in that spirit. And I accepted. And then I told my wife, Natalia, and she said, Philippe, are you certifiably insane? People will listen to the radio and they will not realize it's a moot, and they will think that you are supporting a war in Iraq without a further resolution. So I withdrew from that. I think if I had done it, everything would have gone differently. What then happened, of course, I and with many colleagues became, you were one, Stephen, although I think we weren't directly in contact, but as you know, there was a sort of groundswell of you. And I, about a year after the war in Iraq, having expressed rather public views, sat at a dinner party next to a young, actually not so young, editor from Penguin, who said, what do you do? And as you know, you tell people you're a lawyer, and it's a big yawn and a turn off, and people don't get very excited until you say you deal with nuclear testing and mass murder and wars, and they go, oh, well, that's really interesting. And Margaret Blumen, my first and beloved editor for a Plus Grand Public, said, well, it sounds interesting what you do, Iraq and all of that. If you can send me a 10-page proposal, I'll give you a contract to write a more general book for Penguin. It was a very nerve-wracking 10 pages, I have to say. I spent a long time on it. I sent it off, and it was silence. I got anxious. And then she said, absolutely, here's a contract, a couple of £1,000, write a general book on international law for the Grand Public. And it focused on Iraq. And one thing led to another. I then wrote a book about the Rumsfeld memo on waterboarding at Guantanamo and the recourse to torture of the United States. And then the question arose, what comes next? And at that point, the books were still grounded in what one might call a sort of classical international law mode. They were a bit more discursive, but I didn't speak about myself. I kept my own voice out of it. I didn't express opinions. Everything was footnoted. And my editor at Penguin said, what are you going to do next? And I gave him 5 possibilities, 5 things I was thinking about. I had just come back from this extraordinary trip to the hometown, although I hadn't known it when I initially accepted the invitation, in a city called Lviv in Ukraine, to give a lecture on the cases that I had done at international courts on crimes against humanity and genocide. And I'd gone off to Lviv and discovered that the man who put the concept of crimes against humanity into international law in Cambridge on the 29th of July, 1945, on Cranmer Road, Hersch Lauterpacht, in his garden of his house, to Robert Jackson, the US prosecutor, actually came from Lviv. And I thought, how amazing that the origins of crimes against humanity may be traced to this obscure Ukrainian city, also known as Lemberg and Lvov. And then I discovered that the man who invented the word, literally invented the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin, had also studied at the same law school. And the folks who were there didn't know about their 2 famous alumni. And I ended up writing a book about those 2 men and my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, who was born in Lemberg in 1904, but had always declined to talk about his experiences. He'd ended up in Paris. That's where I got to know him. And so none of that would have happened but for Iraq. And I suppose in a certain sense, I can pay a certain debt to my old teacher, Chris Greenwood, because if he hadn't given the sort of green light in a sort of way that he did, maybe Britain would never have been involved in Iraq. Maybe the US would not then have gone to war in Iraq. And maybe I'd never have got to know about the Lauterpacht. Life is strange.
Just to come in on that, I mean, we both have a family connection with the Holocaust, and I'm a daughter of a survivor, and I do sometimes wonder whether a family connection drives a certain, even if, as in your case and mine, our families didn't talk about anything that happened, it nevertheless drives a certain approach to the world and approach to law. And what I really loved about East-West is the characterization of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, and their different natures and their different anxieties and their different approaches, both legal and emotional. I wonder whether you might talk a little bit about that, because that was something, you moved from being a lawyer to being a writer in your ability to get across those very different personal relationships with the law and with reality, now history, of course.
Well, of course, having been very excellently trained by fantastic teachers at Cambridge University and then become a barrister, I'd learned and integrated into my very essence. As a lawyer, whether it's as a scholar or a practitioner, you don't talk about yourself. You don't talk about your own emotions, your own passions. Those are stripped out. And they had to be brought out of me kicking and screaming, in a sense, by a wonderful editor in New York, Vicky Wilson at Alfred Knopf, who was the principal editor of East West Street and the Ratline. But I think there is something else that's at play. I plainly loved international law because it resonated in some way with an unspoken family background. I've really come to understand that. But more mysterious to me is, of all the people Elie Lauterpacht could have selected as his first research fellow at the Lauterpacht Center, and I still love and have on my desk here in my room photograph of Derek and Elie and Prince Philippe for the opening ceremony. It was wonderful back in 1984, the autumn of 1984. Why did Elie settle on me? I had taken his course in 1983. He had just come back from Australia. He'd been the legal advisor negotiating on the Law of the Sea Convention. And I've often wondered whether it was coincidence or something else. Elie and I didn't know each other well. We didn't talk about our family backgrounds. I didn't know about his story. It was only 31 years later, in 2015, that I learned that Elie's father, Hersch, was born on Lemberger Strasse in a small town called Żółkiew, just outside Lviv, Lemberg. And then I discovered that my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, was born not only in the same region, not only in the same town, but on the same street as the Lauterpachts. And I remember going to Herschel Road. And Stephen, you're smiling. You knew Ellie, you knew the house, and you know that Ellie's wonderful study. And I said to Ellie, I've got an interesting piece of information for you. And he laughed. He said, well, what? He said, what? And I told him. And you remember his big eyes. He had these big warm eyes. And he looked at me and he just said, I don't know, Philippe, it's just, how have you found these things? How could that possibly be? And as he and I would go on over the next year or two to spend, I mean, hours and hours talking about his father, at one point he said to me, you know, you've asked yourself a lot of questions about my father that I never permitted myself to ask. And I think you're right, Jess, it's not just you and me. Ellie also, one of the most powerful things Ellie told me was that never once, I mean, just a parenthesis slightly, Stephen and I both studied in the fabulous Lauterpacht room in the Squire Law Library, you know, that little oval shaped room. And there was a little plaque on the room, and it, you know, to honor Hersch Lauterpacht. And it didn't say on the plaque that he'd been part of the prosecution team at Nuremberg. I didn't know that until I started work on all of this, actually. I didn't know he had been the person who persuaded Jackson to use the term crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg Statute. And Ellie had never once had a conversation about his father's work on Nuremberg. And Ellie said to me, my mother, his mother, Rachel, Hersch's wife, lived, you know, on Cranmer Road, said to her son once, Hersch would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. And it was about what he'd experienced at Nuremberg. I mean, I think it's impossible not to be affected, each of us, by our own baggages, whatever it may be. But also, I think more interestingly, there are ways of communicating. There are ways that somehow, I suspect, it wasn't just coincidence that Ellie settled on me. He didn't know, he told me anything about my family background. He didn't know I was Jewish, I didn't know anything at all when he appointed me. But is it just coincidence, or is there something else that is at play? That I don't know.
I wonder, though, it's always amazing how you've excavated so much from the research that you've done, and I must say I really do hope anyone who hasn't read it reads East West Street, because it's a fabulous interplay of really deep intellectualism in many ways, but in a completely accessible way because of the narrative that you create, both about yourself and about Lemkin and about Lauterpacht. And yet at the same time, it's intriguing what you say about the distancing that is the kind of traditional approach for legal scholars, because I think that has been changing. I mean, one of the things that I think your work and the work of many others has done is to take up the social consequences so powerfully that it becomes harder to disconnect yourself. I mean, I suppose you still, and I'd be interested in your observations, still as a barrister representing clients have to be thinking about things from the perspective of the client. It's not about you. But certainly in your writing, it's become so much more personal, and yet it's personal not because you're just self-absorbed. It's personal because those connections matter to the bigger story that you're trying to tell. And for me, that also, back to your question, Jessica, happened around the Iraq War, that I found as well, that moment when it really became, I thought, morally important for people who had some level of background expertise in a subject to try to be more in the public sphere, to share that and to try to shape events to the extent that that was possible. And I think, therefore, the self becomes more engaged because of that sense of ethical or moral commitment. Do you still, I'm interested, Philippe, do you still try to separate yourself out of your work when you're a barrister?
It's a really interesting question that I've thought about a lot. I absolutely, what you've just said resonates with me. Iraq was a moment where I came to understand that as an international lawyer or as a legal academic, what I did, I loved and I value hugely, and I wouldn't have done anything differently. But I came to realize that it wasn't enough for us just to be speaking to each other.
Right.
And I think the moment that I realized that was on the march in 2003, where more than 1 million people were walking, and many were carrying banners which talked about the United Nations Charter and the rules of international law. And I thought, how interesting that they seem to be interested in international law. Philip Allott once said to me that the day he will know that he has succeeded in his work is when taxi drivers are talking about international law. And a few years ago, he got in touch, I can't remember if it's an email or he rang up, and he said, shocking things happened, Philippe. I was in Edinburgh and I took a taxi, and the taxi driver had a copy of your book, Lawless World. And we started talking about it. It was both shocking and wonderful. And I think that's what I've come to understand. I mean, with East West Street, you've got a book. I just yesterday got the contracts for the 24th language, Romanian, and it actually came out yesterday in Catalonian. And I'm just amazed that a book that, as you say, really has at its heart international law is read by an intelligent, broad audience. We're literally now talking about hundreds of thousands of people. They're interested in what we do. So we do, in fact, have to reach out. We have to find a way, without losing those skills that we picked up from the Lauterpachts and the Greenwoods and the Bowitts, of attention to detail, being balanced, being fair, supporting our arguments, reaching out to a bigger audience. I had to be pulled kicking and screaming by Vicky Wilson at Alfred Knopf to insert myself into the text, because for nearly 25 years, I'd been told you can't do this. I'm now comfortable doing it, but I do realize that there is a very deep interplay between what I do in the International Court of Justice as an advocate and the way I write these books. I've really come to understand that what I learned, for example, from Derek and Ellie, to make your arguments accessible, clear, straightforward, simple, not to cut corners, but present stuff in a way that a panel of 15 judges on the International Court who come from 15 different countries, 15 different legal cultures, you're not in an English court. You need to understand that you need to tell the story and make the legal arguments in a way that people from vastly different backgrounds will understand it. The master of that was someone we haven't yet mentioned, another professor of international law at Cambridge, James Crawford, who of course now is at the International Court of Justice, was a founder with me and with Jessica of Matrix Chambers, and he was the absolute master. In preparing, we did many cases together. What a joy to work with James, how much I learned from James. We would prepare arguments for cases by looking at the backgrounds of individual judges and fine-tune, putting ourselves in the position of the reader of our written arguments, the listener to our oral arguments, and asking ourselves, how will the judge from China react to this? How will the judge from Slovakia react to this? And of course, that was very important, because up until then, before I'd been before the court, my audiences were an English audience or an American audience. And I think that work with James has been hugely significant. And I took it in a positive sense when one of the judges, Peter Tomka, in a very nice way, a very generous and gentle way, said, in terms of my advocacy style at the court, you're a storyteller, Philippe. And I think there is a direct connection between the way I've written these books, which are restrained in a certain sense, and I've had to develop relations with the sons of Hans Frank, Nicholas Frank, and the son of the main person in the new book, the Ratline Otto Wächter, his son Horst Wächter, respect for sons who found themselves in difficult positions. And I think I've learned that in the courtroom. So I think these are two books that are written by someone trained at Cambridge, but who has been a courtroom lawyer, very much so.
Intriguingly, these connections are so strong. James Crawford was actually the external examiner for my PhD thesis. And I remember his, well, obviously extraordinary talent and capacious knowledge of international law, but also, frankly, his generosity. He was a wonderful external examiner. He was engaged. I ended up having, I think we had a 2.5-hour conversation, something like that. And it was wholly reaffirming in the process. And I think that's partly because when you start thinking about narrative, and James does think about narrative, I completely agree with you, that forces you, I think, to also be trying to develop your capacity for empathy, if I may put it that way. Because to tell a story means you have to understand something about motivation, and you also have to be thinking about how the story is received. As you put it, how is the Chinese judge going to understand this? And that, to me, is a fundamental talent that lawyers increasingly need to develop to be effective, is that strain of empathy in argument.
But you know what, Stephen, I think James, coming back to the Iraq point, I think James's election to the Whewell chair was crucial. Because one of the things, wonderful as Cambridge was in my time, and you've heard my glowing, warm feelings towards it, it was a very hierarchical place. People were warm and they were generous and they were friendly, but it was uber hierarchical.
Yes.
And along comes this large, friendly, warm Australian who brings his Australian values, probably more Canadian values too, actually, where the working relationship is flat. So you'll be in a case with James, and James just wants to hear from everyone, however junior. You know, you've experienced this yourself, Stephen. The arguments, he wants to be told by a junior person, actually, you've got that wrong, James, or Professor Crawford, or whatever, and here's another way of thinking about it. And he's completely open to that. Now, that, bless him, was not Ellie's style. I remember I once had a consultation, and I say this with the deepest respect and with more than love, as you know, my feelings towards Ellie. I once had a consultation with him. We did a wonderful case, which was in a porter cabin in the north of England. We acted for the government of Ireland on some crazy idea to create some new nuclear waste facility, an underground mine, Nirex, in Cumbria. And Ellie and I turned up for the hearing, and it was very early in my days as a barrister, I mean, early 90s. And Ellie said, right, Philippe, we're going into the consultations with the Attorney General of Ireland, and you are not to say anything in the consultation until I tell you it's okay to do so. And I was totally cool with that. That was how it was. I was a young barrister, and he was famous Ellie Lauterpacht QC and blah, blah, blah. I would do what I was told. But many people who know Ellie well and love him deeply will know that when Ellie's been in a meeting for an extended period of time, he has a capacity to nod off. And I found myself in a situation in which Ellie had nodded off during the consultation, and I was being addressed by the Attorney General, having been told by he who had nodded off not to speak. And it was a sort of big kick under the table. Ellie, but somehow Ellie managed, whilst being asleep, to follow what was going on. But James was of a different style. And I think the letter that we wrote, a group of international lawyers published in The Guardian, addressed to the Prime Minister, Mr. Blair, on why he needed a further resolution. James and Vaughan Lowe signed on to that letter. And that would never have happened in the 70s or the 80s. And the fact that the Whewell Professor of International Law and the Chicheley Professor of International Law at Oxford would be willing to put their name to a letter like that, I think was a change of place for Cambridge and for Oxford. And that opened a door. They were effectively saying, it's okay for you guys, the younger ones, to stick your necks out. We're with you and we'll put our necks on the line. So Cambridge changed in that period. And I think that was a very, very significant change.
Stephen, do you see a big difference between, say, Cambridge and McGill, the Canadian British approach to that role of academics in public life?
Well, I think that Philippe is right, that the tradition here was for a very, very long time a kind of, well, I'll be as aggressive as to say a hermetic seal around the argumentation, the process of being an effective lawyer. And as Philippe said, there was this idea that law and politics were really completely separate spheres of endeavor. That was never something that I experienced when I was learning law. Interestingly, I mean, there were debates about those issues. Not everyone had the same position, and they still don't today. In fact, I'm working on a book that talks about these issues right now, which is trying to model myself a little bit on the type of work that Philippe does. But I think that there's been a longer tradition in North America, which was largely coming from probably what are called the realists in US legal history, that it was okay to think of law as being part of a broader social discourse, if I may put it that way, that included politics and philosophy and sociology. And I think that took longer to really penetrate into the United Kingdom, certainly in international law. I think there were other areas where it came here more quickly, but in international law it took a long time. But now I think the traditions are more compatible, if I may put it that way. And I think in all, as Philippe will, and you would attest to, I mean, there's just a robust debate constantly about how to understand law's role in society. There is no one view of that amongst lawyers, but I think it's a more expansive discussion than took place in Cambridge, even into the 1980s.
Because that's so interesting, and I think it's so important, and I want to take it a step further. It's not just law's relationship to politics, but I think, and Jess, in one of your questions, and I apologize, I didn't really respond to it, law's relationship to literature. And you have a literature background, which I wish I had, Stephen, but I don't have. But it's what this recent work has allowed me to do is much more explore those points of connection. And I want to actually pay testament to a Canadian poet in this regard, who's influenced me, I think, very greatly and is never often associated with the law, but that is, and I think he is the finest poet of my time, and that's Leonard Cohen, who devotes much of his poetry and songs, it's very interesting, a constant theme to law. In his very last album, there is a song called Treaty, which I love. And I was one day having a conversation with a very dear Canadian friend of mine about this. I had written an article, I'd written a profile of Leonard Cohen and one of his songwriters, Sharon Robinson, for the Financial Times. This too comes out of my work on Iraq, a completely indirect connection. And I mentioned this conversation. I was sitting in an arbitration with a very distinguished Canadian lawyer and a very dear friend of mine, Yves Fortier, who you will know, Stephen.
I do.
And Yves said to me, well, I read your article, Philippe, in the FT. He wrote me an email about it. I said, I was amazed to read your article in the FT about Leonard Cohen because actually, you probably don't know this, but he said, Leonard Cohen sat next to me at McGill Law School. We studied criminal law together.
That's right.
You see, you know that. I was astonished, and that explains so much to me. It explains so much to me about some of the lines in Cohen's poetry and songs that touch me so deeply. But I think, again, in some other way, it is a point of connection. And I think one of the things that the next generation of my students and your students and young scholars, I think will open up much more is this more interdisciplinary approach to break ourselves out of this little hermetically sealed world that we occupied, the lawyer, the legal scholar, into these other areas. And I find that so exciting, but I think some people do find it very threatening. And that is an interesting debate going forward.
Gosh, there's so much in that, Philippe. I share your love of Leonard Cohen. As it turns out, I'm a Montrealer. And in fact, so the connections are amazing. My mother-in-law went to McGill with Leonard Cohen, and they were very close friends. And I will say, though, that Cohen did reject law, certainly as a career, but I have absolutely no doubt that the time he spent at the law school was actually quite formative. And I agree with you that you see many references to questions of judgment and questions of balancing in Cohen's writing. Now, I do think it's also fair to say that, I mean, there are such strong resonances from the Talmud and Jewish studies. And of course, the Talmud in its structure and the way people interpret it has very significant legal resonances as well. So it's sometimes hard to tease out what is the Talmudic background and what is the legal background, if I may put it that way. But on your basic point, I couldn't agree more. The work that I'm trying to do now actually does draw explicitly on literary sources to help understand from a narrative perspective legal concepts and frames. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And back to Jessica's question, interestingly, I think that did start earlier in North America, for example. There was this wonderful professor named James Boyd White from the University of Chicago, I think, who really launched a kind of law and literature program way back in the 60s and 70s. And I think now that is capturing the attention of many, many more people. But you're right as well that it's challenging and for good reason. I mean, one of the things one has to be careful about in any form of interdisciplinarity is becoming too much of a generalist, especially from a legal perspective, not actually knowing what you're talking about, if I may be frank, and sort of skating along the surface of many things, borrowing references from here, there, and the other place, without actually having a good grounded knowledge of the concepts that are fundamental to the argument you're trying to make. And to go back to our earlier point, that for me has always been one of the things I hold on to from my Cambridge legal education, is just the importance of being grounded in the law, but I hope then being expansive in one's ability to draw on other social, cultural influences to help us shape the law going forward.
To tell a story effectively as an advocate, you need to strip out the literary side, the emotional side, and yet have the basis in literature, in empathy and emotion that literature gives you to understand who you're talking to and how they're going to respond to what you're saying. What you don't want to do is you don't want to give the impression that you yourself are telling an emotional story. You want the judge to feel that you're telling him something totally neutral and that the whole exercise is utterly technocratic. But behind that has to be a profound understanding of how that may be understood by that person. So it's almost a separation of them before putting them together in your presentation.
I think there are, Jessica, there are points of commonality. I've just come from recording, I'm making a 1-hour program for Radio 4 on the life of my beloved but recently departed neighbor, the writer John le Carré, who despised lawyers but was fascinated about them. And every one of his books has some ghastly lawyer. But my role was to, with his manuscripts over the last 20 years, was to check that the lawyers were properly characterized. So he'd turn up on the front door with his latest printout on his home computer, usual procedure, Philippe, usual procedure. And I'd mark up the language and what they wore and how they spoke, just of the lawyers. That was my limited function. But in doing that, I came to understand how he writes and the magic of his writing and how it is that he is able to write page turners, because he treats his readers as extremely intelligent. He doesn't impose his conclusions upon them, and he gives them clues from the outset as to where this may be heading and allows them, the reader, to imagine that they have solved the mystery before the writer has done it for them. In other words, to make them feel they're very intelligent. And that, Jessica, is exactly what we do in courts. We never tell a judge, we never tell her what she should do. We want to lead the judge to a position where the judge reaches the conclusion that we wish the judge to reach without ever saying, and this is what you must do. So that they have, if you like, imagined as the reader has imagined, they've solved the problem, they've come to the conclusion. They're not simply parroting something that some counsel has told them to say. And I think the parallels between storytelling in literature and in law, the more I've immersed myself in this, is I've been fascinated by the parallels in this.
But what struck me about, I mean, it's very interesting what you said, because I was going to ask you how you managed to develop your literary technique for East-West, because there is a big leap between Torture Team and East-West, a change in style. And actually, you've just described perhaps the literary trick that you managed to learn and develop and produce in East-West, which does exactly that. It makes you, the reader, the creator of the story, the creator of the characters.
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I really do think that my training at Cambridge and the year I spent at Harvard and life's training in law was really important. The legal stuff has really equipped me to do this. But I've had the benefit, I'm a voracious reader. I'm married to someone who comes from a literary family, a publishing family. And so I read and read fiction and non-fiction. I'm a big, big reader. And I've had the great privilege and happiness of having neighbors who ask you to assist. And I think all of this has combined. But it all comes back at the end of the day to this critical question of how an individual finds her or his own voice. And I think what happened in the hands of this fine editor in New York, I've already evoked, of Victoria Wilson, was that she allowed me to remove the shackles of my training and my professional and scholarly being and find a way that I was comfortable with. And I think that's what happened in my 50s. I found my own voice for the first time, rather than the voice of others that I had learned and ingested. And that, for many people, that comes much earlier in life. It took me a longer time to find that. But I think it's a consequence of a range of different influences that have come together. But at its heart, it's the world of law and literature connecting through individuals as well as through techniques that I think has been so important.
Philippe, does that mean that East-West Street in its first iteration looked completely different from the published version, or did you find your voice as you were writing?
Oh yes, oh yes. 5 different drafts, each of 150,000 words. The first draft was produced by the end of 2011. It was sent by my wonderful, I mean, life is incredibly curious. You know, it was only on draft 3 that my agent, Melanie, in New York, I said to her, "You're being very attentive to this draft, Melanie. I'm very grateful for that. What is it?" And she said, "Well, actually, I have a personal interest here." I said, "What's that?" She said, "Actually, both my grandfather and father are involved in your book." I said, "What?" She said, "Yes, my grandfather was Robert Jackson and my father was Bill Jackson." And she had never told me. She had never told me. She is married to Thomas Pynchon. And so she has this melding of law and literature. I mean, it's a fascinating thing that I think, I'm so glad we've got onto this, because it's making me think more that we need to mine that a lot more. I'm fascinated by what you're working on. And if I can look at any of your drafts and help in any way, I would really love to do that. But the way we do this is complicated. And my first draft, give you an example. You've got 4 men, 4 main men: Lauterpacht, Lemkin, Leon, my grandfather, and the ghastly Hans Frank. Over a 30-year period, basically 1915 to 1945-46, so the way I wrote the first draft was to start in 1915 and then run chronologically, interweaving the lives of the four men. Melanie sends the draft to Victoria Wilson at Alfred Knopf, and she says, well, there is a great story in here somewhere, but I will buy it. But my condition is, one, you rewrite it completely, and two, I am the only editor. So no British editor, no other editor. I accept, obviously, I'm in the hands of a fine editor. And then she says, right, this is how you're going to rewrite it. No intelligent reader will be able to work out the confusions between these four men of the same age. They sort of look the same, they sound the same, so here's how you're going to do it. First, you'll tell the story of your grandfather from 1915 to 1945, the day the Nuremberg trial opens. Then Lauterpacht in the same way, then Lemkin in the same way, then Frank in the same way. And by that point, the reader will have a clear sense of the four different characters. And then in the last third of the book, when you deal with the Nuremberg trial, at that point, you revert to your original conception. You go chronologically, melding and interweaving the four lives. That is brilliant editing. I would never have thought of that. It totally makes sense. And it transforms the book in the hands of a brilliant editor. Actually, it's one of the things that I've realized is that in legal publishing, I say this entre nous, Stephen, but for a while, we really could do with a bit more editing, honestly.
Yes.
I'd never been edited. And
I've had one great editor in my whole experience of legal publishing, I'll be honest. I mean, a truly great editor who helped to reconceptualize things in a way that made the writing much clearer. And that was an editor that I worked with at the American Journal of International Law. And it was really a wonderful experience. I tell young scholars not to be afraid of editors, that they are there genuinely to help you. Now, it's really frustrating if you have a bad editor who does silly things, but it is all too rare in legal publishing. I agree, Philippe. Before we end, we should say more about Lauterpacht, because he emerges as such an extraordinary figure in the writing you've done, not just in the book, but you've also published in the press around Lauterpacht. And I think it would be worth reminding people of this really great figure in European, world, and British international law.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for doing that, because I think he is an extraordinary, an absolutely extraordinary figure. I mean, you and I were in the Lauterpacht room. We knew he was Ellie's dad. We read some of his books, but the more I get into him, the more I realize what an extraordinary person, both at the intellectual level and at the human level. Born in 1897 in a tiny town, less than 5,000 people, Zhovkva, just outside Lemberg, Lviv, moves there in 1915, studies law, moves to Vienna. His PhD advisor is Hans Kelsen, no less. He moves to England in 1923, LSE, gets the Whewell Chair in 1937, and then, of course, is retained by the British to help in the war effort. And so in the midst of all of this, he's writing book after book. He's founding and editing the international law reports. He's doing legal opinions. And he's married to an extraordinary person, and he produces an extraordinary son. But it's always the points of detail. And this comes back to what we were saying earlier. This is the sort of litigator, courtroom, scholarly approach. You're caught by the tiny point of detail, because we three understand, as so many people do, that it is often in the most tiny point of detail that a greater truth is illuminated. And the one that comes to mind as I'm speaking with warmth and with affection is an anecdote that I put in the book. A rainy day in Cambridge. He's in Trinity. He's a fellow. He's allowed to walk across grass, but it's sodden. And he doesn't want to damage his shoes. So he tiptoes across the grass, and someone observes him, simultaneously expressing his position of authority, we learn from that he cared about status. He cared about his position. He was formal. He cared about these things, but also the deep humanity, the sort of the ridiculousness of the exercise in a very endearing and warm way. I don't know how entertaining he would have been to have been as a dinner companion. Steve Schwabel tells me he was a wonderfully warm man. Ellie paints a figure that is slightly more forbidding, I have to say. And I don't know, I've tried to be fair and capture him in the sense that I could, but of course I've never met him. Not only that, I've never even heard his voice. He only ever recorded for the BBC for the third programme on one occasion. And Robbie Jennings tells the story of how he went home, settled into his armchair in the evening, switched on the wireless, and was so horrified by the sound of his own voice that he never allowed his voice to be recorded again. And there is apparently no recording of the voice of Hersch Lauterpacht. And I think that says so much in so many ways.
What's intriguing to me about the work that he did around Nuremberg and the creation of the Charter and the concept of crimes against humanity goes back to some of what we were talking about before, the interplay of the social, the legal, the political. I mean, if you think about it, this was an extraordinary moment. This was a moment when all of a sudden international law wasn't just about coordination of relations as amongst states, but was really expressing a very profound moral value about individuals in international law. And you make a big point of this in your work. And that was in and of itself a dramatic shift. So some of the shifts that we've been talking about as more recent were really presaged, I think, by the work that Lauterpacht did at that time. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to make sure we got back to this, because it was an extraordinary moment for international law. Not perfect. The whole victor's justice issue certainly came into play, but the statement that he wanted to make, that crimes against humanity actually spoke to the power of the individual within the international system, was quite fundamental. The other point I would want to make is, of course, he was a European here in Cambridge. Not the first, because another great international lawyer, Lasse Oppenheim, had the connections here. And so intriguingly, at that time, Cambridge was opening itself to a wider world. And I guess that's something I would want to reaffirm and express the importance of at this precise moment in world history, is that we remain completely open to that wider world and attract the kind of people like Oppenheim, like Lauterpacht, who can make a profound difference for the entire planet.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, Stephen. I find that so important. It is an anxious moment because the barriers seem to have been coming down in UK PLC, and we need to really fight for that. If I can just close on a couple of other points on Hersch, we really must do something in Cambridge, maybe later this year if we're able to be there in person. It's the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg judgment on the 1st of October, and I just wonder whether we couldn't do something for a broader audience, not purely an academic event, for the town to reach out to the broader community in Cambridge and honor Hersch Lauterpacht and his role in putting crimes against humanity and the protection of the individual into international law. His book, of course, was huge in influencing the United Nations Charter and the European Convention. But it's a very lovely note perhaps to end on. Just yesterday, I got a letter from English Heritage to confirm that a blue plaque will go up on the London home of Hersch Lauterpacht next year to honor him. And that is very wonderful. And let us not forget that living in Cambridge, actually in Grantchester, there is one person who knew Hersch Lauterpacht, and that is Christine Jennings, the widow of Robbie, who I'm in touch with and who I've had conversations with about Hersch. And I just hope that if we do something, we could find a way to involve her. She is the most discreet of people, but she remembers him. And I think there are probably others in Cambridge who will remember him. And this may be the last moment one could have a gathering of those who knew or recalled Hersch Lauterpacht. And speaking for myself, I would love to be in a room to hear from those people because he was a special and unique person. And he made Cambridge in many ways, contributed to its eminent place today and for the future on international law, and how fortunate I think we all feel to be part of that community. I certainly feel that.
Absolutely, and that is a wonderful way on which to end. I'm just so grateful to you for taking the time, and also to you, of course, Jessica, for really helping us shape the conversation. It's been marvelous, and your point about reaching out to the wider community, of course, is exactly what this Cambridge Festival of Ideas is all about. So we're starting that process, but you've properly challenged us to continue it and celebrate the 75th anniversary of Nuremberg and the extraordinary role that Hersch Lauterpacht played. Thanks very much.
Thank you both very much. Thank you.